bottom of the page, 51a. And what we learned on Friday was all about um, the shir, the song that was the songs that were sang in the at the ceremony of the Simchas Beis HaShoeva, the music that was played there, and the question that we were dealing with is if it was Doicha Shabbos or not. We had a machlokes uh, how to understand a machlokes. It was an argument.
On the video's off. You can adjust it now.
Excuse me. It was an argument about where is the argument, meaning that there's one argument about if the musical instruments override Shabbos, and then there's an argument about when does that argument apply? What are they referring to? There is an argument about overriding Shabbos. Is that referring to the music that was played in the water drawing ceremony of Sukkot, or is that argument about the daily music that was played when they would bring the communal burnt offering? And so there is an argument about overriding Shabbos. We don't know when that applied, and we had an argument about it. And the Gemara proved that it must be talking about that the argument is only about the water libation ceremony. Did that override Shabbos? That music. However, the music of the Beis Hamikdash that was played, when they would bring the daily sacrifice, that everyone agrees it would override the Shabbos. That override Shabbos. It was only the music of the Simchas Beis HaShoeva that there is an argument about. Our Mishnah was of the opinion that it does not override Shabbos, because our Mishnah, in page 50a, the Mishnah says that the water drawing ceremony, Khalil, the flute that was played during the water drawing ceremony, sometimes was for 5 days. It was played on Sukkot. The 7-day holiday of Sukkot was, you only used the flute 5 days. There's some, and some years it was 6 days that it was played, but it was never played all 7 days. And the reason it wasn't played on 7 days is because there's always a day that's Shabbos and there's always a day that's Yontif. And our Mishnah basically holds that it doesn't. The Mishnah says it spells it out. It doesn't override Shabbos and Yom Tov. Again, that's one opinion. There is an argument about it. There is another opinion that says it does override Shabbos and Yom Tov. That was the opinion of Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda. But this is the conclusion of the Gemara, that it's an argument, and that argument applies only at the musical instruments of the water drawing ceremony. And the Gemara concluded Tiyuvta the Rav Yosef betarti Tiyuvta. The conclusion was that we have proven wrong Rav Yosef in both statements of his, that we have sources that obviously that show that the argument is not the way Rav Yosef said it, and the agreement is not where Rav Yosef thought they all agreed. So we basically proved him wrong both in where the argument is and where the agreement is. Then the Gemara went into what is the source of if you hold Ikar Shira Bepeh or Ikar Shira Bekli. What is the source of that? In other words, why would you say that instruments are insignificant or not as significant as the vocals, or maybe they are just as significant as the vocals? Where do we see that? So the Gemara brought two proofs, one way and one the other way. One proof was from Divrei Hayamim Beis. One proof was from actually Both are from Divrei Hayam base. One is from chapter 29, and the other one is from chapter 5. But basically, one implies like the music was instruments, and the other one implies that the music was vocals. One of the issues that the commentaries have, including Tosfos over here, is that if you look at one of the verses, the Gemara brings a verse to prove that the main thing was the vocals and not the instruments. And it brings a proof from a verse, and the verse only mentions Meshoirim, Mechatzrim, and Meshoirim. It mentions people who blow the trumpet and Meshoirim singers, and seemingly that shows that the vocals are the main thing and not the instruments. And the commentaries struggle, including Tosfos, with why does the Gemara leave out the fact that it disregards almost the fact that that same verse does mention musical instruments. Now, the fact that it mentions mechatzetzrim, it's a hard word to pronounce, mechatzetzrim, the fact that it does mention the trumpets, that's not really the question that Tosfos is bothered with in the other commentaries, because the trumpets, they were really just part of a it wasn't really music accompaniment. It was a blowing ceremony similar to what we do on Rosh Hashanah. They had to blow certain blasts. That wasn't really the music. So that's not a proof that the musical instruments are significant and as significant or more significant than vocals. But the question that the commentaries are bothered with is that if you look at the end of the verse, it's a long verse over there, but the end of the verse says, ukaharim koil bachatzoitzroitz uvim tziltayim uvakli hashir. It talks about other instruments in mitziltayim, which are cymbals, I think, in b'chli shir, and then it says in other musical instruments, uvahalel Hashem, and in the Hallel to praising Hashem with the Hallel. To Hashem, ki tov, who is great because he's great, ki li'olam chastoi, forever is his kindness, v'habayis molei onan beis Hashem. And basically, the verse emphasizes klei hashir, mitziltayim, which is a musical instrument, and klei hashir, musical instruments. So the verse that the Gemara is using to prove that instruments were insignificant or not as significant, that verse itself says musical instruments. So this is what the commentaries are struggling with, and they come up with various explanations of why it's not a proof from the end of the verse. Tosfos says if you look at the verse, it divides these two elements of the song into two. In other words, first you have Meshoirim, that's the first in the first half of the verse, talks about the vocals, the singers, that they would sound their voice lahalel, to praise Hashem. And then at the afterwards in the verse, it mentions with musical instruments in the Hallel, ubehalel. So if you look at the way it says, it says there's vocals to praise Hashem, lihalel, and here it says bihalel at the end of the verse. And so Tosfos says, you know why? Because the end of the verse is called accompaniment. It's in the Hallel. This is not used to do the Hallel, to do the praises to Hashem. This is during the Hallel, they would add the music. But the first half of the verse is emphasizing what's the main thing. In the second half of the verse, you see it from that word bihalel. The second half of the verse uses the term bihalel. It means that it was accompaniment for the vocals. And so actually the verse does imply that the main thing is the vocals and the other is just accompaniment. So that's the way Tosfos explained it. Another interpretation is the fact that it uses the term Meshoirim and it doesn't use that term to include musical instruments. We see shira, the word meshorerim is vocals. They happen to be musical instruments, but if you want to, if you want to know what the ikar shira is, what is the song, that the verse pretty much spells out that meshorerim is the vocals, and so that would be also a proof that that's the ikar shira, even though there was also musical instruments. Now, another understanding is that there's a Gemara that explains the Gemara in Erchin really talks more about this, about the musical instruments and the shira of the Levium. The Gemara in Erchin mentions that if you look at this verse, it mentions Meshorerim and Mechatzetzrim next to each other. And so the Gemara there understands that there's something called a hekesh, a juxtaposition that proves that Meshorerim is a biblical obligation, just like Mechatzetzrim, just like the trumpets are biblical. So the Meshorerim are also biblical. So if you want to look at the fact that there's a comparison that the verse is making from Mechatzetzrim to Meshorerim, that comparison only applies to the Meshorerim, the first half of the verse, and that you don't see in the second half of the verse. It doesn't. You don't have that same hekesh. You don't have this comparison. Now, because of that, in other words, based on the Gemara there, our Gemara is basing it on the Gemara there, and because the Gemara there uses this, understands it to be a proof that Meshorerim are biblical, that would mean that only the vocals are biblical, and the musical instruments are not biblical, and that would be another proof. In other words, the Gemara just brings the verse here, but really it's relying on a Gemara there, which emphasizes that there is a hekesh, a juxtaposition, which emphasizes that the vocals are biblically obligated, and that implies like the musical instruments are not biblical and maybe they're only rabbinic. And that's an interesting proof. I didn't look it up, but I would like to look that up. And the reason is because if you look at the verse, it does mention a second time Chatzotzros at the end. So it sounds to me like you could say there's a additional hekesh. You do see it as Chatzotzros later on, right next to Mitzotayim and Klei Hashir. So maybe I'd like to see that Gemara. It's a Gemara in Erchin. Well, I'll have to take a look and see why the Gemara only sees it as a hekesh. There's a juxtaposition for the vocals and not for the musical instruments, since at the end of the verse it does also compare the Chatzotzros to the other musical instruments. Maybe, and I'm just guessing that maybe when it mentions the first time the Mechatzetzrim, that is referring to the biblical obligation of blowing. Maybe the end of the verse where it says B'chatzotzros, that's talking about the music of the Chatzotzros, the trumpet music. And maybe that wouldn't be a proof. I guess that would be the answer, that the Chatzotzros it talks about at the end of the verse is not the biblical obligation of Chatzotzros. That's referring to the musical instruments that included all different types of instruments. So maybe that would be the reason why that's not considered a hekesh. It's not proof. It doesn't really prove it. Only the first half of the verse is a proof that the vocals are biblical, and that would answer why how we see that the vocals are significant in the The other musical instruments are less significant. And
Can I ask a question?
yes, Jeffrey.
I think they pick a very strange place for quotation. So if we want to talk about the Chatzot Rosh, we have it in the Torah. We just read the other week, right?
It's in the Torah, right?
Right. But, so why use this verse if it's referring to the Chatzot Rosh? Doesn't make sense. And secondly,
no. 1 second. Don't jump to your second thing. Explain what you mean. Why we're not trying to prove anything about Chatzot Rosh. We're trying to show that Meshoirim is similar to Chatzot Rosh. That's what we're trying to prove. According to this understanding, again, this is the Aruch Liner's understanding. So the Gemara proves it, and it basically is relying on that other Gemara where it says Chatzot are biblical and Meshoirim is biblical, and our Gemara says, and our Gemara brings the verse that basically says this about the Meshoirim, and it doesn't mention about the as we leave out the instruments, and so the Gemara is proving that Meshoirim is more significant than the klei shir. The Meshoirim, the vocals, are more significant than the instruments. That's what our Gemara is proving. Again, it doesn't spell out the full proof. It relies on another Gemara there that shows that there's a juxtaposition between Mechatzitzrim and Meshoirim. And you're right, in the Mechatzitzrim's proof that it's biblical is not this verse, but that is our Gemara is not really dealing with. We don't really, our main thing is not about the Chatzot if the trumpets are biblical. Our main thing is the fact that Meshoirim is more significant than the other klei shir, and it says it next to Mechatzitzrim.
But in the ancient world, two things. So in the ancient world, if you talk about singers, it automatically meant with accompaniment. All the people in the ancient world around Israel understood that if you use a word like shira, that it means it's accompanied music. They didn't play instrumental music alone. They didn't sing without accompaniment. Number two, we have many verses from the Tehillim that talk about the instruments. Mm-hmm. They named the instruments.
Right.
Okay. And sometimes it says at the end, they note which particular instrument.
Right.
As Al Hashminis. So Al
Hashminis,
we just read in the Haftorah on Shavuos.
Right.
Okay. And from that we can understand that all the music is based on having klei zemer. So,
you're trying to. I think your proof is a nice proof, but not to take it to that extent. In other words, I don't know if you can prove it as much as you're trying to prove. What you're trying to prove is how important the instruments are, and you see it from Tehillim. Yes, definitely there is importance. In fact, that's our whole Gemara is talking about that. They did play musical instruments. Our Gemara is not disagreeing with that. And you see it in Tehillim, you see it even in these verses, that there definitely were instruments. The question is how significant the instruments were relative to the shir, and what was the source of playing these instruments. Was it more important or was it less important? And as we saw in the previous Gemara, to the extent that the musical instruments possibly were even played by the avadim, by the slaves, by the servants, by Israelites. They weren't played by the Leviim. There definitely was room to say that there is a difference between the vocals and the musical instruments. So our Gemara is just trying to prove, but it's not disagree. In other words, what you're saying is true, that that music included instruments. Yeah, it definitely included instruments. Now, every time, that I don't know. You're taking it a little far. You say every time there was music, it always included instruments. That's saying a little far. We don't know. In fact, our Gemara mentioned that on Shabbos and Yom Tov it wasn't deicha. The conclusion of the Gemara is that it was deicha Shabbos, but there was an opinion in the Gemara that during the and that there was an opinion in the Gemara. Again, it's proven wrong, but there was an opinion that understood that the regular sacrifices had had vocals, but the musical instruments did not override Shabbos. So there definitely was such an understanding that you could have music without instruments.
Only
So we don't have history that there never was such a thing. I think you're taking it a little far, but you're right. In general, there was, and that's true. That is correct.
Well, you know, with King David. But look after the Shiras HaYomim, we have a verse.
Look at that. The women played with their whatchamacallits, the tambourines. The men didn't. So maybe that could be the difference between men and women. Maybe women always had music. They had tambourines.
You know, this is Asfas Hayom. What's amazing is that they thought it was important enough to bring or acquire instruments so they would have it ready.
The women, but not the men. But they still sang. And again, and do you have any proof in Devaira? I would have to look up Shiras Devaira. Was there instruments playing when Devaira sang her music? I don't think, even if there was, I don't think it's a proof that you always need it. And even if it was, let's say there always was, it still doesn't tell us how significant it is as related to the halachas of overriding Shabbos and what we're if Iker Shira is bepeh. However, our Gemara wanted to develop that idea. If it's Iker Shira is bepeh or bechli, we don't. It won't prove if it's more significant than the vocals. You know what I mean? It could be that you'll find a source that there always was. Again, I think you're taking it a little far, but maybe you will find such a source that there always was. But I don't think it could prove. I don't think it actually is a final, like concludes, it gives the verdict, a final stamp that it must be Iker Shira is the Kli. It doesn't like finalize that.
I don't know. I don't know that I don't want to say the Iker Shira is the Kli. I'm going to say the word Shira means there's music.
Well, not this one, not Meshayrim. Meshayrim does not. Actually, this pasuk would be a proof against that, because the Meshayrim was referring to song, and later on it mentions it was accompanied with musical instruments. So Meshayrim here does not, this would be a source against that. That would seemingly be the Gemara, at least the way the Gemara is understanding the word Meshayrim. Okay, anyway, but again, your point is well taken. It seems correct in a general sense. Okay, now the Mishnah we started on Friday. Let's start the Mishnah again. We're going to start from page 51a. The Mishnah, which is maybe 8 lines from the bottom of the page, 7 lines maybe from the bottom of the page, 7 lines up from the bottom of the page 51a. The person who didn't see the Simchas Beis HaShoeva, this water drawing ceremony joy, did not see Simcha, complete joy in his days, and he never really saw complete joy. I mentioned one of the commentaries adds over here that this joy really included a double joy, because the joy of the Simchas Beis HaShoeva was not only a gashmias, a physical joy of dancing and music, but there was also a spiritual joy, which is the joy of Ruach HaKodesh, the joy of receiving divine inspiration. And we saw that because Yoina Hanavi, where did he get his nevuah? Right after he rejoiced at the Simchas Beis HaShoeva, that's when he was able to receive the prophecy about going to Nineveh and so on, and rebuking them. That he got it from the Simchas Beis HaShoeva. And the way we know that is because he went to Yaffo to go to the boat, and he wanted to travel to Tarshish. why didn't he go to Aku, which was closer, a port that was closer to where he lived? The answer is because he was coming from the Beis Hamikdash. He was celebrating the Simchas Beis Hashoeva, and he received this Ruach HaKodesh right afterwards. So that's at least the understanding the Yerushalmi has of Yoina receiving the revelation at the Simchas Beis Hashoeva in the Beis Hamikdash. And the way the Gemara understands it, Misham Shayavim, the way at least the Yerushalmi the way Yerushalmi explains it, that Misham Shayavim, that Ruach HaKodesh, it uses a plural. It sounds that Yoina was an example, but maybe it was much more. This is one example of many that received Ruach HaKodesh from the Simchas Beis Hashoeva. I'm just going to take a moment. I'm going to switch to my phone to do the Zoom. So just give me 1 second.
Recording in progress.
Just give me 1 more second. Okay. Can you hear me clearly? Anyone?
Yes,
Yeah,
I hear.
I hear
Yes.
you.
Yes.
Okay. And
Yes.
you don't hear like an echo?
No.
Oh,
Okay, perfect. So, so the Mishnah says, whoever didn't see the Simchas Beis Hashoeva didn't see Simcha, never saw joy in their days. And as I just mentioned, that one of the commentaries says that it has to do with the double joy, the Gashmias physical joy and the spiritual joy. Now, what is also interesting is that this seems to contradict the Mishnah that we had in Tainus, where the Mishnah over there says that Lo Yhayu Yomim Tovim LiYisrael Kachamisha Asar B'Av. There were never joyous days amongst the Jewish people like the 15th day of Av and Uchayom HaKippurim, and like Yom Kippur. And our Mishnah says that the greatest joy was the Simchas Beis Hashoeva. So which one was greater joy, Simchas Beis Hashoeva or the day of Yom Kippur and Tu B'Av and the 15th of Av? That celebration had to do with the fact that it was allowing a lot of singles to find their shidduchim, and the Gemara mentions that there were 5 reasons why it was such a special day. As it mentions a number of different events that took place, all about unity of Klal Yisrael. So it sounds like that day was those 2 days were very joyous days, and here it is the most joyous. And here it sounds like the Simchas Beis Hashoeva was the most joyous. So one of the commentaries says that it has to do with the fact that in the Beis Hamikdash, this was the most joyous. After the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, then the Mishnah in Tainus, then that was the most joyous, Yom Kippur and Tu B'Av. But I'm not sure if you have to go that far. It seems to me like you could answer it and reconcile it differently. And that is that the Simchas Beis Hashoeva
was quite an event to see. You saw joy. You saw the joy of the people that were involved in the dancing. You saw that joy. It was sort of like it was a vision to see. It was something it was an event that you saw. The joy of Yom Kippur and Tu B'Av was not just something that you saw. You didn't see Simcha. You felt. You really felt it. You were part of it. So maybe you could differentiate that way. Again, just a thought. I didn't look into other commentaries, see how they answer this seeming contradiction, but it seems like there are other ways. It seems to me like there should be other ways of reconciling our Mishnah with the Mishnah in Tainus. I'll have to look into that as well. Now, the Mishnah continues and says that the Motzei Yom Tov Harishon Shel Chag, on the day following Yom Tov, Yardu li'ezras nashim, they would go down to the Ezras Nashim, to the women's section of the Beis Hamikdash, and there was where they celebrated the Simchas Beis HaShoeva, u'mestaknen sham tikkun gadol, and they would establish there a great fixing, which we'll see later what that refers to. The Gemara is going to explain what they did, but basically they went down to the Ezras Nashim. Now, what does that mean? They went down. So there were a bunch of steers that separated the Ezras Yisrael to the Ezras Nashim, and meaning the regular Israelite area to the women's area, which meant women were allowed to go or commonly went up to and including the women's section. In other words, not that it was an official women's section, but the women would go. They had an area in the courtyard of the Beis Hamikdash that was 135 amos by 135 amos. It was 135 cubits by 135 cubits. That was like a square in the courtyard of the Beis Hamikdash that was called the Ezras Nashim. Of course, there's a discussion. Does it mean that the women are not allowed to go further than that, or they weren't common to go further than that? So that's a discussion. But the point is that this was called the Ezras Nashim, and the steps, they would go down those steps in order to do this Simchas Beis HaShoeva ceremony. Now, who would go down those steps? It means the Kohanim and the Levites that were inside the Beis Hamikdash, they would sort of like go out to the outer area in order to celebrate this and do this ceremony of the Simchas Beis HaShoeva. And in Menorah Shel Zahav Hayusham, there were golden candelabras that were there, and the Arba Sfalim Shel Zahav B'Rashehem, and there were 4 bowls of gold on top of these candelabras. The Arba Sulamais L'chol Echad B'Yechad, and each one had 4 ladders, meaning each of the menorahs, these candelabras, these holders that held 4 big bowls. So basically, each bowl had a ladder. So if there were 4 bowls on top of for each menorah, so then there were 4 ladders for each menorah, because 1 ladder per bowl. Yeah, and so l'chol echad. So each one had its own ladder. The Arba Yeladim Pirchei Kahuna, and there were 4 children, I shouldn't say lads. Yeladim, Rashi translates as Bacharim, young men that would, from the Pirchei Kahuna, from the young ones of the Kayanim, that would go up those ladders will be Yadehem, and in their hands was Kadim Shel Meya V'Yeshim Lug. They had pitchers of 120 lug. Lug is a certain measurement. Our Kiddush cup is a Revius Halug. It's the Kiddush cup is a quarter of a lug. It's called a Revius, a quarter. Because it's a quarter of a lug. So there were four Kiddush cups, or small Kiddush cups, would be a lug, and then this was 120 of those lugs. So assuming Kiddush cup is assuming a revius, a quarter is about 3 ounces or so. So then a lug would be 12 ounces, and these were 120 times 12 ounces. And that's how big. That's how much oil they would use for the bowl of the menorah. Now, it doesn't mean that each of them carried this amount. Each of these young koyanim, it means that they each carried a quarter of this amount, and means each one carried 30 lugs. So each menorah, which had 4 bowls and 4 ladders, so each of these young koyanim would carry 30 altogether. Every menorah had 120 lugs of oil. 120 of these lugs. We could maybe just translate it as 12 ounce, 3/4 of a pan. I don't know, maybe translate it a liter.
Oh, Sean.
Liter. What was that? So that's the light that would shine during this ceremony. Now the Mishnah continues and says, from the beloyim are worn out pants, the pants of the koyanim, and from their belts, which both of these, the pants and the belts, were part of the big day kahuna, the garments of the koyanim. The koyanim had 4 garments: Ksainas, Abnate, and the Mechnasayim and the Mikbas. They were Nefes. The Mikbas was the hat that the koyanim wore. The Mechnasayim were their pants. The Mehem Yadehem, which really is the term, is called the Abnate. The Mishnah uses the term Hemya Nehem, but it refers to the belt, and then there was the Kasainas. Now, Mishnah only mentions the Michnasayim and the Hemyan, which is or Hemyan, the Avnei. It only mentions 2 of them, the pants and the belt. They made from that, Mehen Hayumaskian, from them they would tear off a part of it, meaning some type of a wick, uvahen hayumadlikin, and that was what they lit with in order to light up these big menorahs. They would use these big candelabras, golden candelabras with a huge amount of oil. They would light up all of these with these wicks from the worn out clothing of the holy clothing of the koyanim. Now, why did they use the michnasayim and the avnei? So something that we see here is that they specifically wanted to have linen. The Gemara elsewhere in Tractate Shabbos mentions that wool is not a good wick, but linen is a good wick. And so the pants of the koyanim, which were made out of linen, that would have been very good for the menorah. These. Now again, this is not the menorah of the Beis Hamikdash. This is the menorahs that were used for the ceremony of the Simchas Beis HaShoeva. This was the other menorahs. These are other candelabras. These candelabras did not have the 7 candles that we read about in this week's parsha, actually. But these menorahs we see had four. But the point is that these menorahs, or we see that they had four bowls, I should say, that held the oil, and these menorahs were not inside the Beis Hamikdash; they were in the courtyard of the. They would light up the entire. The next wording of the Mishnah is there was no chaser, there was no courtyard in Yerushalayim. She'ina meira meyor Beis Hashoeva, from the light of the Beis Hashoeva, because the whole Har Habayis, the whole mountain, which was higher than the whole city, and these menorahs were very high up, so they would end up lighting up the entire city, and it would end up being quite an event, quite the light up was really it really shined. They lit up the whole city at night. Now, so what did they use for the wick? They used the pants, the worn-out pants of the Kohanim, and the avnei. Now, the pants makes sense that they used because that was made out of linen. The avnei, the belt of the Kohanim, was made out of wool and linen. It was made out of both. Now, the Gemara says that they didn't use the avnei. They wouldn't use that for the menorah itself, for the Beis Hamikdash. The menorah, the reason is because if it had a little wool in it, it wouldn't be good enough to burn. It didn't burn so beautifully. But for the burning purposes of the Sivan Beis Hashoeva, that was not a problem. It didn't have to burn as perfectly. We were able to use a little wool. And again, the avnei was made out of wool and linen. Interesting, even though that's normally shatnez, you're not allowed to wear. But there are exceptions to shatnez. One of them is the belt of the Kohanim. The truth is, the Kohen Gadol also had garments that were shatnez. Kohen Gadol for the Leishas, the Ephod, but the regular Kohanim had a belt that was considered shatnez, and that was acceptable. The Florida understands that. Well, I mean, the public basically spells it out that you have to wear it, but it's made out of wool and linen. But we understand that is an exception to the rule of shatnez. Only you're not allowed to wear clothing.
Rabbi,
yeah.
can you mute background noise?
Yeah. So the avnei, we can understand, was not allowed to be used for the menorah and the Beis Hamikdash, but these menorahs, which are outside the Beis Hamikdash, is not a problem. Tysus is bothered over here with the fact that what about the kasina, which was the tunic? Why was that not allowed to be used if that that was linen? Why did they use the kasina? And Tysus ends with a question. He doesn't answer. Why did they use the tunic? That was a kasina. So the Mishnah only mentions the pants and the avnei. It doesn't mention the tunic. And to answer Tysus' question, one of the commentaries has a thought. He says, it seems that maybe you could answer Tysus' question by explaining that the menorah and the Beis Hamikdash, they did not use the avnei because it had the belt, because it had wool. The menorah and the Beis Hamikdash did not use the pants, probably because they probably did use the pants because it wouldn't be respectful to use the clothing that covers a person's private area for wicks in the Beis Hamikdash. what they probably did use. They probably used the kasainas. They probably used the tunic. So if they used the tunic, the worn out tunic for the menorah in the Beis Hamikdash, so that's why it wasn't used for the extra menorahs that were outside the Beis Hamikdash. For those, they didn't have the tunics to use because the tunics were being used for the holy menorah in the base inside the Beis Hamikdash. Instead, they used them. They used instead for the outside menorahs. For that they used the pants, the worn out pants. They used the avnate, which didn't burn as good because it had wool in it. They melt that, and so those two things are what they used for the for the outside candelabras that were being used for the Simchat days. So that gives us an understanding of a way of answering such questions, such as bothered why they didn't use the tunic. The answer is because the tunic was used for the actual menorah inside the holy, and that was what they used those worn out tunics for. And therefore, they didn't have them to use the outside candelabra used for the ceremony. Now, there was one thing surprising, as Tyson doesn't ask, why didn't they use the head covering? They had some type of hat, called the mikvah. Why didn't they use that for the menorahs? What about that? That was also made out of linen. Why did they use that for the Tyson doesn't even ask that? Surprisingly, why did they leave that out? One of the commentaries wants to say maybe because it was thinner fibers, so it wouldn't have been good for the wicks. So that could be an answer maybe to why Tyson doesn't even ask that question. The Mishnah continues and mentions Hasidim ve'anshe Ma'aseh, the Hasidim, the pious people, the Anshe Ma'aseh, hayu meraktin b'fteihem. They would dance before the people that were standing and watching. So you had the Hasidim that were involved in the actual dancing. They would stand before the others that were watching, or possibly be another interpretation if they would stand in front of the Levites that were singing. The Levites were singing, and so the Hasidim and the Anshe Ma'aseh would be dancing in front of them. Again, we're just translating what does it mean in front of them. And it either means in front of the people or in front of the Levites. Why was it that only the Hasidim, the pious people, danced and not the rest of the people? And one of the commentaries mentions here that it had to do with the fact that the simcha, this joy, was all about the fact that Hashem's Shekhinah, Hashem's presence, rests in our midst. And the fact that Hashem's presence is a reward for the righteous in the world to come. And because of that, it wouldn't have been appropriate for anyone that wasn't considered pious to participate. Instead, they would participate by watching, but they weren't actually involved in the actual dancing. In other words, there's a symbolic element over here of what the ceremony symbolizes, and because it symbolized the divine presence, it was appropriate to have the greatest be involved in the dancing. Again, everyone else participated by being there and watching, but because it involved talking about the Shekhinah, that was something that would be honorable to have the Hasidim, the Anshe Ma'aseh, the greatest of the people, and symbolizing that the Shekhinah is rest amongst Klal Yisrael, amongst the Jewish Now, and as a praise for Hashem allowing us to be on this great merit of the Shina, and it was appropriate to have, the honorable dignitaries dancing, symbolizing this idea. Not that the other people are not deserving of the Shina, but as an honor to the Shina, because it symbolized the Shina, this was more honorable. That seems to be the understanding. Now the Mishnah continues, and it says they would dance ba'avukai shel har, with flames shebiyadayim in their hands, and which the understanding is that they would do some type of juggling. They would throw it up and use these torches, flame torches. They would throw and catch, and some were even able to do juggle of four, at a time. In other words, we're familiar with juggling three things, but the Gemara talks about, Rashi brings down that they would, some were so expert that they would even do four, and some even did 8. They would throw them up and catch them and put on a good show. They would say before them words of praise, and we'll see in the Gemara what that refers to. The Leviim and Leviim would, as we've been talking about the last 2 days, about the musical instruments. So the Leviim would play musical instruments. The Kinoirai, Ubenavala, Ubemitziltayim, Ubechatzoitzrai. They would play all these different musical instruments. Clay shear, below mitzvah, unlimited amount of musical instruments. They could add, or they could do more or less. It wasn't limited to how many they use, but they use all these different instruments. On the 15 steps, a yardite, the Ezra Yisrael, Ezra Nashim, that would go down from the Ezra Yisrael, from the Israelite area in the Beis Hamikdash to the Ezra Nashim, were steps that led down to the women's area of the Beis Hamikdash. Again, it was that 135 cubit by 135 cubit area in the courtyard of the Beis Hamikdash. And these steps, they were around, they were like a half a circle steps. On those 15 steps, where they would be playing specifically for this ceremony of the Simchat Beis HaShueva. And those 15 steps, says Teneged Chamish Esrei Shir Hamalois Shebat Tehillim, symbolized, it was corresponded to the 15 psalms in the Tehillim that are called the Shir Hamalois psalms. They all start with Shir Hamalois or Shir Hamalois. One of them starts with, it's 15 psalms from Psalm 135, from Psalm 120 to 134, through 134. And those psalms, there were 15 of those psalms. There were 15 steps in the Beis Hamikdash, in between the Ezra Nashim, the Ezra Yisrael, the women's area, and the Israelite area. Sha'aleihem Leviim leimtem b'shir v'oimrim shira. On them, the Leviim would stand with their instruments, and they would say praise during the ceremony of the Simchat Beis HaShueva. I should mention, Tosfos on the previous page really refers to this side of the page. For some reason, it was printed on the earlier side, but the bottom Tosfos mentions that these steps that the Leviim they would play, the music for the Simchat Beis HaShueva, was different than the duchen, than the platform that they would play music on and sing for the korbanos, for the sacrifices, when they would be pouring the libation during the daily sacrifice. Now, and Taisus mentions that he says, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov brings the Gemara in Yuma that says, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says, Maila Haisa Sham, there was a step there, Gavaya Amma, that was an Amma tall, and there was a Duchen Nasan Aleha, there was a platform on it, and that was where that Maila Haisa Beit Ezras Yisrael Ezras Kayanim, and that was between the Israelite area and the Kayanim area. So what Taisus is telling us is that the area where the regular music daily, not the one during the Simchat Beis HaShoeva, not the one during this water run ceremony on Sukkot, but the regular music, that was done a little further in. It was done a little further in into the Beis HaMikdash. In other words, a little closer. And it was closer to the altar. In other words, there's the outer area of the women's area. Then you had the Israelite area. Then you had the Kayanim area. So the area in between the Israelite and the Kayanim area, that was where the regular music was. So it was a different area where they played, slightly different, slightly further. Closer to the altar, the music that was played on the daily basis. And two kayanim would stand the Shar Ha'elyon on the upper gate. That would go down from the Israelite section to the women's section, which is called the Shar Nikanor gate, in Shnei Chatzot Yadayim. So they would stand there by this gate, by this called Shar Nikanor, and the two Chatzot, there were two Chatzot trumpets, the Yadayim in their hand. Kara Hagever.
On Northwest 25th Street for 3 miles.
The Kayan would call out and make an announcement that get up Kayanim to your Avodah, and get up Leviim to do your Maimad, and so there was a Kara Hagever, there was a individual Kayan that would be in charge to make this announcement. There is another understanding that it refers to the Kara Hagever is the Tarnagoyl, the roosters would make this would crow, but there are two interpretations in the Gemara. So these are so this is a term used, Kara Hagever. Different opinions what it refers to. Either the Kayan in charge or the actual rooster would make the crow. But anyway, once that happened, either way, it was Taku V'Hariu V'Taku. They would blow the trumpets as a sign that it's time to draw the water from the Mayon, from the spring called the Shiloach spring, and then they would go down to the Ezras Nashim. They would go down the steps to the women's section. Higio Lamala Asiris. They would reach the 10th step. Taku V'Hariu V'Taku. Again, they would blow the trumpets. Tekiah, Teruah, Tekiah, and Higio Lazara. Then they reach the actual courtyard of the women. Taku V'Hariu V'Taku. And they would blow again Tekiah, Teruah, Tekiah, and they would continue blowing while they were going until they reach the gate that went out Mizrah from the east, and that's where they would go to get the to draw the water. And And when they reached the gate that goes out from the east side of the Beis Hamikdash, they turned around towards facing the Beis Hamikdash. So they were walking one direction, but then they turned around to face the Beis Hamikdash. And they said, our fathers are that were in this house, is referred to the they put their backs towards the sanctuary, and their face faced east. They would bow down to the sun. But us, our eyes face Hashem. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, they would double and say, Anu laka, ulaka einenu. They would say, we are to you, Hashem, and to Hashem our eyes face. And then they would go and draw the water. Okay, we're going to stop here. Sei gesund, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.